This Women's Month, we take a look at some of the challenges faced by women across different spheres of life. Research has shown that South African women account for 19.4% of business owners. The gap is further widened by the fact that about 20% of small businesses fail within their first year. To discuss that, we're now joined by founder and managing director of the African Storyteller, Thuli Phiri. Thuli, very good morning. Thank you for speaking to us. You've been in business a number of years. What are some of the challenges that you have experienced?
Morning, Hugo, and morning to your viewers. Thank you so much for having me. I think being in business for most women is a bit of a challenging, move to make, simply because women are uniquely positioned to actually be caregivers to the home, to be active members of their community, and so on and so forth. Yet when we get into the business space, the playing ground is level. You compete on the same rules with any other business person, be they male or female. I think add to that, the most challenging thing is that most women-owned businesses are small businesses. And sadly, in our environment or in South Africa, the rules that govern small businesses are actually the same as those that govern big businesses. So from a SaaS perspective, the compliance regulations are the same. From a HR and labor and relations perspective, the compliance guidelines are the same, and so on and so forth. So generally, the biggest challenges that women face when they go into businesses in South Africa, in Africa, and around the world is the lack of support structure in terms of provision of professional services, which are very key in ensuring that a business thrives. I always say and make an example that most people start a business because they are good at what they do. So let's assume you're a carpenter and you make the best chairs. Unfortunately, being the best carpenter does not translate to running a successful business. When you run you need to manage finances. You need to have financial management skills. You need to understand contracts. You need to be able to do contracts that work in your best advantage. You need to hire the best people. So recruitment, retention, and ensuring that you actually adhere to all the labor relations laws that govern your employees is very important. You need to invest in IT. You need to invest in sales and marketing. All of those are probably skills that as a carpenter or somebody that makes the most beautiful chairs, you do not have, and you need to outsource. They come at a cost. So imagine you're starting, capital is a challenge, you already need to compete in a very unlevel, playing field, and add to that, you need to actually have the support and the provision of all these services, which you either do yourself when you're small and it basically takes you away from doing your core, or you outsource and again, it basically costs you money. Those are some of the challenges that we face as business women getting into business in South Africa and across the continent.
Now, a few years ago, you penned an article, which I had the opportunity to read, and a number of things that you spoke very, very strongly about. And one of those is the belief or lack of belief in the B-BBEE rating. And you said it doesn't really afford women or give women the unfair advantage or the advantage that it should give them.
Well, the B-BBEE rating actually is a disadvantage in many ways. So look at me. I'm a level 1 B-BBEE contributor, according to the B-BBEE codes. But guess what? When I compete for business, that really doesn't account for anything. What accounts is, can I deliver? Will I meet the quality standards? Is my pricing correct? And most importantly, sadly, how long have I been in business? So if you've been in business for 12 months, for 24 months, not many big companies are willing to give you a chance. I think, we've gotten to a point where a lot of big companies use the B-BBEE scorecards as a box ticking exercise. They give a lot of small businesses the small jobs that would not impact their own work or their own quality or their own reputations, and that doesn't allow them to grow. And sadly, very, very sadly, you are supposed to compete in pricing with very big and established companies that can basically spread their costs across, the amount of business that they actually have. So the B-BBEE scorecards and the rating in itself is really a PR exercise that is that only benefits both government and big corporate companies. It has no benefit to us. On a day-to-day basis, we actually have to compete with the very same companies that do not meet the B-BBEE ratings and standards or scorecards, and they get the business because they have huge balance sheets. They will not be expected to demand payment within 7 days or 30 days because they have proven track records. They've been around for the longest time. They can hire the best talent, and most importantly, their track record and reputation speaks for themselves, versus a person that's starting out and really still needs to prove themselves, and nobody wants to, risk or try out or go on a trial and error with you on their business or their brand.
Thuli, when we look at Africa and how it's viewed on the continent, across the globe, it's not viewed in the best possible light. How would you describe the problem with Africa's prevailing narrative, and how do we deal with it?
I think it's actually 2021, and it's really sad that when you travel around the world to countries like Russia, to America, to any overseas country that you can think of, there is still very little understanding of Africa in 2021. We are still seen as a poverty-riddled continent. We are seen as a corruption-riddled continent. And sadly, we are seen as a continent that basically has a bow out and is really looking for handouts. And I don't blame the world. I blame us as Africans. The onus is on us as Africans to actually rewrite Africa's narrative and promote content that shows the opportunities that Africa has got to offer, that shows the skill sets that Africa has, that shows our competitiveness across various key markets, and nobody will do it for us other than ourselves. So I started the African Storyteller out of the frustration of having to travel around the world and being asked stupid questions like, have internet in Africa? Oh, can you actually go pass by in Kenya and drop this parcel for me because I've got a friend in Kenya? And you're like, well, look, Africa is 52 countries. They're all very different. They're all, very competitive. You get the same standards of quality and services you would get anywhere around the world. And most importantly, we are a continent that has very intelligent people that can work and compete anywhere in this global, universal market that we find ourselves in.
Allow me to come in here, please. Is part of this narrative not also about the ignorance of some of those people in the West? Because how does an informed individual, regardless of the narrative that is being spelt out, ask you to drop off a parcel in Kenya when you're on your way to South Africa? I'd like to think it's about the ignorance of that particular individual.
Yeah, true. I think ignorance is part of it, but it still doesn't change the fact that is, the perspective or the perception that they have on Africa. I think the other part of it is that in the main, the content that is being pushed out there about Africa is not coming from Africa. The media houses that basically try to tell African stories to countries that are outside the continent are international news agencies, and in the main their stories and their angles are only informed by what they see. They do not have the whole picture of Africa. And I think we as Africans need to be the ambassadors of the continent in our own unique way, in our own spaces, with whichever audiences that we touch. We need to be the ones that basically talk to what has South Africa got to offer, what has Kenya got to offer, why Ghana has the best coffee, and so on and so forth. Because I've just learned that we could actually say people are ignorant in all of that. However, in order for us to attract investments, those investors need to make decisions, and they base their information on making their decisions on where to put the money based on the information at hand. And sadly, the information at hand that they would have is basically the misleading information that still shows Africa as being primitive, that still shows Africa as being backward, and that shows Africa as a place that has no room for growth and where it's very hard to do business. And in our day-to-day lives, I basically talk to investors, I talk to CEOs, I talk to government people, I talk to heads of states, and really the message is one. Africa is ready for growth, and Africa is the next growth terrain for investors because we have everything that it takes to actually grow. Problems, corruption, poverty, and all of that, they're everywhere. You go to the USA, you find poor people, you find corruption. You go to India, anyway, the same problems that we have are global problems. They are not African problems.
Now tell us about the African Storyteller and what stories you've told and how you've told them.
Absolutely. So the African Storyteller basically is a company that seeks to position Africa to Africa and to the world, and that seeks to rewrite Africa's narrative by providing two essential services. One is business communications, and the other one is stakeholder relationship management, because in order to understand business, you need to understand the stakeholders that you need to align with, and also you need to articulate what is in it for the markets that you are investing in. So how do you actually contribute to South Africa's National Development Plan? How do you contribute to the key priorities that the countries are actually looking at? We've done quite a lot of amazing work around the continent. We are just 4 years, but for a 4-year-old agency, we've actually worked in over 15 countries in Africa. We have worked in financial services. One of the big projects that we've actually worked on was the acquisition of Aon Insurance by Capital Works and the rebranding of that to Minet Holdings. And we were working on the go-to-market strategy to ensure that the countries, the 12 African countries that would now own this new brand, understand what's in it for those countries in terms of, ensuring that they adhere to good governance, they don't retrench employees as they come into market, they offer consistent services, and most importantly, they add value to those countries. We've worked on Russia, South Africa, Business Engagement Summit on the sidelines of the last BRICS meeting that was hosted by South Africa, and we hosted the Business Engagement for Russia, which basically attracted over 200 captains of industry from South Africa and Russia, just to really demystify the fact that the relationship between South Africa and Russia is not just about nuclear. Russia and South Africa are partnering on so many other key sectors, including the healthcare sector, where you've got Aspen as one of the South African companies that has a huge presence in Russia. They partner in the financial services sector, where you've got Gazprom Bank as one of the financial banks or companies that are present in South Africa, and really looking at opportunities between the two countries and where they can leverage one another. We've worked for Gilead Sciences in their campaign to promote the prevalence of hepatitis B and C as part of their sponsorship of the last Africa Cup of Nations, where we basically got journalists and experts in hepatitis B and C to travel to Egypt, Cairo, to be part of the soccer tournament, and using that as a platform to put the spotlight that more Africans are being killed by hepatitis B and C than HIV/AIDS and TB across Africa, simply because there is lack of knowledge, especially knowledge that it is treatable. So we've done quite a lot of big projects that really seek to simplify the narrative of how investors are adding value to Africa, but most importantly, how African businesses can actually go and invest in other countries like your Russia and partner with Russian companies and so on and so forth.
Final question. There seems to be a huge focus on the perception of the West about Africa and how we need the West. Billion people on the continent. Africa is set to be the new frontier. It is a new frontier. What can we do internally? What do we need to do country to country on the continent without necessarily waiting or looking to the West?
I think it's very important for Africans, and in particular African investors, to be intentional in spreading their footprint across Africa. I look at companies like Dangote, who are basically quite huge in West Africa and are now making inroads into Southern Africa. What are the incentives that the Southern Africa region is giving to African investors to actually, increase their investments, increase employment within the continent? But also, most importantly, I think we need to have policies that are quite friendly to African investors. It should be easy for Africans to put their money in Africa and basically have a say in how policies need to shift to align with the needs of the day. One of the biggest challenges about the continent is really just moving around. I mean, in this day and age, it's quite unbelievable that it's probably quicker and easier for me to jump on a flight and go to America than it is to go to Cameroon. The US is one direct flight, but Cameroon is probably 2 or 3 flights away from me. And that's basically a lot of time wasted going back and forth. So I I think there's a need to look at how we do movement around the continent much more easier, how we integrate, and most importantly, how we look at attracting African talent to work in the continent for African investors, and then basically enable those investors to then invest elsewhere in the world, but make Africa attractive for Africans to invest in Africa by ensuring that policies are friendly to our own investors and that moving around the continent is much more easier and much more simplified.
Thuli Phiri, thank you so much for your time this morning. And she is the founder and managing director of the African Storyteller, talking to us about the need for Africans to make investment on the continent easier for Africans.